The Young and the Restless Thurdays full the 12th of February 2026 suggest that Genoa City is entering a phase where desperation, pursuit, and betrayal begin to overlap in dangerous ways, creating a chain reaction that threatens multiple families at once. At the center of the storm, Abby Newman and Devin Winters are finally closing in on tangible clues about the whereabouts of their son, Dominic. A breakthrough that brings both relief and renewed terror. After days of emotional paralysis and helpless waiting, the emergence of real leads jolts them back into action, transforming grief into urgency. Every fragment of information, every half-confirmed sighting, sharpens their focus and reinforces the truth they have been resisting. Mariah Copeland is running out of places to hide. And the fragile fantasy she has built around Dominic is beginning to crack under pressure. The realization that their son is not only alive but being actively moved forces Abby and Devin into a state of relentless pursuit, where hesitation could cost them everything. At the same time, elsewhere in the Newman orbit, Noah Newman's decision to chase Sienna Bacall all the way to Los Angeles signals another emotionally charged pursuit. One rooted not in parental terror but in unresolved connection, suspicion, and unfinished business. Reinforcing the theme that no one in this world can simply walk away from the consequences of their choices. As Abby and Devin piece together Mariah's movements, the stakes escalate rapidly when new revelations indicate that Mariah has crossed an even more dangerous psychological threshold. She confides in Dominic that she intends to take him out of the country, a plan that marks a turning point from impulsive escape to permanent severance. This is no longer about hiding or buying time, it is about erasing boundaries, identities, and legal realities altogether. In Mariah's fractured logic, leaving the country represents freedom, safety, and a chance to start over where no one can take Bowie away from her. But this plan exposes the depth of her instability, because it requires her to believe that Dominic can be seamlessly removed from his life, his parents, and his future without lasting harm. The cruelty of that belief is not malicious, but it is profound. However, Mariah's resolve is immediately threatened by the pressure closing in around her. Abby and Devin are no longer reacting, they are tracking her, anticipating her moves, and shrinking her options. The closer they get, the more Mariah is forced to improvise, abandoning carefully imagined plans in favor of survival-driven decisions. Each adjustment increases the risk, heightens her paranoia, and pushes her deeper into a corner where panic begins to override even her distorted sense of purpose. The tragedy unfolding here lies in the imbalance of power and perception. Abby and Devin are fueled by clarity. Their son has been taken, and they will stop at nothing to bring him home. Mariah, by contrast, is fueled by belief rather than logic, convinced that the world is conspiring to tear Dominic away from her, and that every step she takes is an act of protection rather than harm. The more she feels pursued, the more justified she becomes in her own mind, transforming Abby and Devin from grieving parents into perceived threats. This dynamic ensures that resolution will not come gently. Even if Mariah abandons the idea of leaving the country, the damage is already done, because the mere willingness to consider it exposes how far she has drifted from reality. For Abby, learning that Mariah intended to flee internationally with Dominic is not just frightening, it is unforgivable. Confirming her worst fears that Mariah will never stop escalating as long as she believes she is acting out of love. While this personal crisis unfolds, the corporate and psychological warfare elsewhere in Genoa City intensifies, drawing Phyllis Summers and Billy Abbott into a new level of moral compromise. Phyllis, ever attuned to shifts in power, becomes increasingly certain that Kane Ashby is on the brink of surrendering to Victor Newman. To her, Kane's resistance has always been temporary, a performance destined to collapse under Victor's pressure. Faced with the prospect of losing leverage entirely, Phyllis reaches a point of pure desperation, where principles become expendable and alliances transactional. In that state, she turns to Billy, not because she trusts him, but because she recognizes a shared willingness to cross lines when cornered. Their partnership is born not of strategy but of fear, and that makes it volatile. Together, they make the calculated decision to betray Kane, understanding full well that once this step is taken, there will be no retreat to moral high ground. The implications of this betrayal grow darker with the release of promotional footage showing Kane unconscious, a moment that speaks volumes without explanation. The image strongly suggests that Phyllis and Billy may have resorted to drugging him, an act that strips away any remaining ambiguity about how far they are willing to go. This is not a symbolic takedown or a boardroom maneuver. It is a physical violation, a choice that places them firmly on the side of manipulation rather than persuasion. For Phyllis, the justification likely lies in her belief that Cain would never yield voluntarily, that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures. For Billy, participation in this act reflects his ongoing struggle with self-destructs, his tendency to leap before thinking, and his attraction to chaos when control feels out of reach. Together, they form a dangerous echo chamber, each reinforcing the other's worst instincts while convincing themselves they are acting out of necessity rather than greed or vengeance. What unites these parallel storylines is the theme of desperation overriding restraint. Mariah's plan to leave the country with Dominic, Abby and Devon's relentless pursuit, Noah's chase after Sienna, and Phyllis and Billy's betrayal of Cain are all driven by the same underlying force: the refusal to accept loss. Whether it is the loss of a child, control, love, or power, each character responds by pushing harder, moving faster, and crossing lines they might once have respected. The result is a world where consequences accumulate faster than anyone can manage them, and where every act meant to preserve something precious instead threatens to destroy it. As the week unfolds, the sense of inevitability grows heavier, Mariah's options narrow, and with each forced change of plan, the likelihood of a catastrophic mistake increases. Abby and Devon move closer to reclaiming their son, but the emotional cost of the pursuit continues to mount, threatening to permanently alter their marriage and their sense of trust. Phyllis and Billy may succeed in gaining the upper hand, but the image of Cain unconscious serves as a warning that their victory, if it comes, will be poisoned by guilt and exposure. And looming over all of it is the certainty that Victor Newman's influence has not diminished, it has merely shifted, exerting pressure through fear rather than force. In true Young and the Restless fashion, no one emerges untouched. The clues Abby and Devon uncover bring them closer to Dominic, but also closer to confronting the full extent of Mariah's breakdown. Phyllis and Billy's alliance may grant them temporary dominance, but it binds them together in a secret that could destroy them both. And as these threads tighten, Genoa City moves toward a reckoning where intentions no longer matter as much as outcomes, and where every desperate choice leaves a permanent mark. The question is no longer who will win, but who will still recognize themselves when the dust finally settles. After Dominic was finally brought home and the worst of the immediate terror had passed, the relief in Genoa City felt strange and fragile, like a thin layer of glass stretched over deep, churning water. Everyone could see that the child was safe, warm, and back in his own bed, but nothing felt the way it had before he disappeared. The world had not simply snapped back into place because Dalm was physically present again. Instead, the rescue only threw into sharp focus all the fractures that had formed underneath the surface while he was gone. For Abby Newman and Devon Winters, that fracture had a name: Mariah. As soon as the adrenaline faded and the search turned into recovery, the reality of what needed to come next settled over them with suffocating weight. There had to be consequences. There had to be accountability, and there had to be decisions about what kind of future, if any, Mariah would be allowed to have in their lives and in Dominic's life. That was the moment when their unity began to crack, not because one of them suddenly cared less about their son, but because they each saw Mariah through a very different lens. Devon, who had watched Mariah spiral and had understood on some level that her behavior came from a place of deep psychological damage, could not bring himself to see her only as a kidnapper. To him, she was a sick woman, a wounded soul whose judgment had been twisted by trauma, fear, and an overwhelming, misplaced maternal attachment. Abby, however, could not get past the image of her baby being taken from her arms, the empty crib, the missing child, the hours of not knowing if he was alive. For her, no diagnosis, no explanation, no sob story could erase the fact that Mariah had chosen to steal her son. Both positions were valid, and that was precisely what made it so destructive. This was not a simple case of one parent being right and the other being wrong. This was two people, both in agony, both clinging to different truths that could not easily coexist. Devon's insistence that Mariah was ill was not a naive attempt to excuse her, but a desperate need to make sense of her actions in a way that did not turn her into a monster. He knew her history, the way her life had been shaped by manipulation and control, the scars left by her upbringing, the fragile ways she had glued herself together over the years. When he looked at her, he didn't just see the woman who took Dominic, he saw the friend who had once promised to help bring his child into the world. The woman who had bonded with the baby before anyone else, holding him inside her and then in her arms, talking to him, naming him Bowie. Building a connection that was never meant to be permanent but had clearly felt that way to her. In Devon's mind, this wasn't a straightforward crime, it was the catastrophic endpoint of untreated pain. Abby, by contrast, could not afford to soften her view, because every time she tried to imagine Mariah as someone broken rather than cruel, her own body remembered the sheer animal panic of calling out for her child and getting no answer. Her anger was not theoretical. It was rooted in the visceral knowledge that her son had been taken away and might never have come back. To her, anything less than harsh punishment felt like an insult to her fear, an erasure of what she had endured. So when talk turned to charges, prison time, restraining orders, psychiatric evaluations, and long-term restrictions, Abby's voice was sharp and uncompromising, while Devon's was cautious, pained, and full of hesitation. The very same event the kidnapping of Dominic had carved two opposing emotional paths in their hearts, and walking side by side down those paths became almost impossible. As they argued over what appropriate punishment should look like, the space between them grew wider, not always in shouted fights but in long silences, sideways glances, and finished sentences. It was in the way Abby would scoff when Devon mentioned treatment before incarceration. The way Devon would flinch when Abby talked about making an example of Mariah so no one ever dared cross that line again. They still loved each other, they still loved Dominic, but love was not enough to bridge this philosophical chasm about justice and mercy. Every time Abby raised her voice about how Mariah needed to pay, really pay, Devon felt a complicated mix of loyalty and resentment twist inside him. He didn't want to dismiss Abby's pain. He could see she was barely holding herself together, that she woke up in the night just to make sure Dominic was still there, that she jumped at every small sound. But he also couldn't ignore the part of himself that recoiled at the idea of throwing Mariah away, of treating her as nothing but the sum of her worst decisions. That simmering tension didn't just hover around the edges of their conversations about Mariah, it began bleeding into everything else, discoloring their attempts to be partners and parents in the aftermath. The strain was made even worse by the fact that Dominic, blissfully unaware, would sometimes reach for something that reminded him of Mariah, or flash a smile that brought her to mind. And each time it happened, Abby and Devon felt completely different things. For Abby, it felt like intrusion. For Devon, it felt like a reminder that love, however misdirected, had been real. Then, just when it seemed like the emotional weight could not grow heavier, the world around Devon lurched again in a way that felt almost cruel. News came that his sister, Lily Winters, and her children were caught up in their own nightmare, kidnapped in a situation that echo-shadowed the trauma Devon was still trying to process with Dominic. Suddenly, the fear that had been focused on one child expanded into a wider circle of dread. Now it wasn't just his son whose safety had been ripped away and then restored, it was his sister and his nieces or nephews being used as pawns in someone else's scheme. Devon found himself standing in the middle of two overlapping catastrophes, both involving the people he loved most, both reminding him just how fragile safety really was. For a man who didn't exactly radiate joy and enthusiasm on an average day, whose natural state even in calm times could resemble a quiet, slow-moving heaviness, this double blow was almost too much to carry. He walked through rooms like the air was thicker, his shoulders sagging under invisible weight, his expression distant even when he was physically present. Conversations bounced off him. Simple decisions felt monumental. The world took on the dull, flattening texture of someone who has been asked to be strong for too long. People naturally wondered who would help Devon through all of this, who he could lean on now that his marriage was bending under the pressure of disagreement, now that his sister was in peril, now that his own sense of control was crumbling. On the surface, the answer seemed like it should come from the usual places: family, friends, professional support, maybe even Abby if they could find their way back to common ground. But beneath the obvious possibilities, a stranger, more complicated idea began to take shape, one that would have seemed unthinkable before all of this happened. What if the person who understood Devon's spiraling emotional state most intimately was the very woman everyone blamed for his descent into it, Mariah? It sounded twisted, even offensive, to imagine that she could be the one to help him cope, but the truth was that Mariah, in her own broken way, knew what it felt like to live in a world that no longer made sense, to watch love and fear collide until they became indistinguishable. She knew what it felt like to be so consumed with the need to hold on to someone that you would do anything, say anything, ignore any consequence just to avoid feeling abandoned again. When Dominic was found safe and healthy, with no physical harm done to him, the focus shifted fully onto what would happen to Mariah. The adrenaline of the search was gone. The question now was what kind of reckoning awaited her. Legal consequences were unavoidable. She had taken a child, crossed lines that couldn't simply be forgiven away. But as the conversation tightened around charges and punishment, Abby's anger surged with a kind of raw, almost righteous intensity. She raised her voice in every room that mattered: police, lawyers, family, demanding that Mariah face the harshest possible response. She talked about sending a message, about ensuring that line was never crossed again by anyone. Each time she did, Devon felt himself being pulled a little further in the opposite direction. Her rage, while understandable, pushed him to lean even harder into his belief that Mariah was sick, that what she needed first and foremost was serious psychological help, not just a prison cell. The more Abby shouted, the more Devon felt a kind of instinctive protectiveness toward Mariah stirring inside him, not because he excused what she had done, but because he saw the brokenness behind it so clearly. He remembered the way Mariah had cradled Dominic when he was first born, the way her whole face lit up when she held him, the soft, almost reverent way she said the name Bowie, as if she were naming not just a baby, but a piece of herself. He remembered how hard it had been for her to let go, how she had tried to be strong and supportive when the time came to hand Dominic over to his parents, and how, little by little, something in her eyes had grown dimmer. He couldn't deny that she loved the little boy, not in some abstract, convenient way, but in a deep, visceral way that had clearly become the center of her emotional life. That love had twisted into something frightening, yes, but it had been real, and it still was. The knowledge of that weighed heavily on Devon as he watched his marriage strain. To stand fully with Abby in her desire for maximum punishment would mean suppressing his own belief in compassion and treatment. To stand openly with Mariah, or even to argue for leniency, felt like betrayal in Abby's eyes. He was trapped in an impossible tug-of-war between justice for his son, empathy for a damaged woman, and the crumbling foundation of his own relationship. In the quiet moments, when he was alone and no one was demanding answers, Devon found himself replaying every step that had led them to this point. He thought about how quickly perception could shift: Mariah the trusted surrogate, Mariah the devoted friend, Mariah the loving aunt figure, and then suddenly, Mariah the kidnapper. He thought about how his own life seemed to be collapsing from multiple directions at once: first Dominic, then Lily and her children, and how, in the face of all that, he felt less like a strong patriarch and more like a man slowly sinking in place, too exhausted to thrash his way free. And in those moments, the idea of completely condemning Mariah felt like cutting off one of the few people who might actually understand the level of emotional chaos he was carrying. The world might see her only as a criminal now, but he saw her as someone who had already been living in a kind of internal captivity long before she ever took Dominic. That recognition made it harder and harder for him to nod along when Abby demanded that everything be black and white. So the question that loomed over Devon was not just what would happen to Mariah in court, or how Abby would move forward, or whether Lily and her children would be found safe. The question was who he was going to be on the other side of all of this. Would he harden, joining Abby in her refusal to see Mariah as anything other than a threat, burying his compassion beneath layers of anger and fear? Or would he cling to his belief that love and illness make some human decisions too complex for simple punishments, even if that meant watching his marriage crack further under the pressure? As the days went on and Dominic's laughter slowly returned to the house, Devon felt no corresponding lightness inside himself. Instead, he felt the weight of a choice that had no clean answer. He knew Mariah loved Dom, that in her own distorted way she had tried to create a life where she and Bowie could exist without fear of separation. He knew Abby would never fully trust Mariah again, no matter what kind of treatment or remorse came later. And he knew that if these events continued to pile on, Dominic's kidnapping, Lily's abduction, Abby's rage, Mariah's breakdown, something fundamental in him would have to shift. Whether that shift pushed him closer to Abby's unforgiving stance or toward a fragile loyalty to Mariah's humanity remained painfully uncertain. But one thing was undeniable: the future of his marriage, his family, and his own sense of self was now tied to how he chose to see the woman who had both hurt him profoundly and, in some strange, tragic way, mirrored the same brokenness he was now trying so hard to survive.